Chapter 2 of Alexander the Great by Ada Russell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Philip II of Macedonia. Macedonia, over which Turk, Greek, Bulgarian, and Servian have quarreled so bitterly today, became for the first time a united monarchy under Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great. It lay north of Thessaly, from which it was divided by the lofty Cimbunian range of hills, snow-capped Olympus, the home of the Greek gods, towering over its southern border. On the west, the mountains of Skardas and Pindus separated from Illyria and all communication with the Adriatic, except for the narrow valley of Ehudicus and a few mountain passes. In the east, the boundary between Macedonia and Thrace was, until Philip's reign, the river Axius, the Vardar, which flowed southeast to the Gulf of Therme. Round this gulf stretched the fertile province of Emathia, the nucleus of the Macedonian sovereignty. Among its hills stood the oldest capital, Aigai, and lower down, in a dreary position over the marshes, the new capital, Pella, where today scarcely a stone remains of the city from which Alexander the Great set forth to conquer the world. Alexander's successor, Cassander, removed the capital to the coast, and at Therme sprang up the new town of Thessalonica, now the dirty and picturesque Babel of Salonika, of the utmost importance as a railway terminus. Eastward lay the three-pronged peninsula of Chalcidice, for which Philip fought so bitterly with Athens, and farther east, Greek colonies were scattered along the coast as far as and beyond Byzantium, destined in Christian times under the name of Constantinople to become the capital of a new Greek empire, and afterward the headquarters of the Turk. The Greeks of Alexander's day were as anxious to prove that Macedonia was not a Greek country as the Greeks of today are anxious to prove that it is a Greek country. The truth seems to have been that in these northern mountains a conquering Greek stock had united with the native Illyrians and Thracians. The Macedonians spoke a Greek dialect and retained Greek traits, but cut off as they were from communication with their southern kinsfolk, they had come to seem a barbarous people to the cultured Greeks of the south. These latter, however, seldom questioned that the Macedonian kings were of Greek descent, and a legend existed that Perdiccas, a scion of the royal house of Argos, itself descended from Heracles, had fled with his brethren into northern Greece, and after living for long as a cowherd, had gradually conquered all Macedonia. The first historical king of Macedonia is Amnitas, c. 540 through 498 BC, who was compelled to submit to Darius the Great. His son, Alexander I, 498 through 454 BC, extended his domains, but was forced, though extremely unwilling, to aid Chares as his vassal in his invasion of Greece. His right to take part in the Olympic Games was called in question, but the Greek descent of his line was recognized, and he strove and obtained the garland. His son, Perdiccas II, 448 through 413 BC, aided in the destruction of the Athenian Empire. His successor, Archelaus, raised himself to the throne by many crimes, but he was an able ruler, and the patron of Greek art and a friend of Euripides. He came down from Aigai to Pella and established a brilliant court there. Thus the flame of civilization was kindled in this land of the wild beast, and the huntsmen and warring highland tribes. The names of the successors of Archelaus are as much a matter of dispute as the amount of truth in the lurid stories handed down of the crimes they committed, but Macedonia was comparatively tranquil at the accession of Alexander II in 370 BC. He was called in by the Thessalian cities in 369 BC to aid them against the tyrant of Pherae, and proved difficult to get rid of when he had performed his task, but was subdued by the Thebans. He was murdered by the Macedonian Ptolemy, who became regent for the heir, Perdiccas III, and made a treaty with Thebes in 367 B.C., sending Philip, younger brother of Perdiccas, to Thebes as a hostage. There Philip remained, learning all he could in that great school for soldiers until 364 B.C., when he returned to Macedonia. On the death of Perdiccas in 359 B.C., he became guardian of his brother's son and heir, Amyntas, but soon, at the request of the nobles, assumed the kingship as Philip II. At the time when his brother Perdiccas fell, fighting against the hill tribes, Philip II was 24 years of age. His part in the world hitherto had been chiefly that of observer, and we may guess of roisterer, but he at once displayed the very highest practical ability, and brought an iron will to the carrying out of schemes as vast as those of his greater son. Philip loved more to make merry than Alexander ever did, but Demosthenes, no friend of his, was right when he told the pleasure-loving Athenians the secret of his success. Philip, he said, for the sake of empire and absolute power, had his eye knocked out, his collarbone broken, his hand and his leg maimed, and was ready to resign any part of his body that fortune chose to take from him, provided that with what remained he might live in honor and glory. He was more cynical than Alexander, or at least more outspoken about it, for he was accustomed to say that he could take any fortress into which an ass laden with gold could climb, and he did more by diplomacy of this and other sorts than by war. This portrait, drawn of him by an historian of a few centuries later, is not an unfair one. His chief wealth was his army. He was more skilled in obtaining riches than in keeping them. So, though certainly engaged in rapine, he was ever poor. He was equally mild and faithless. To him, no way of conquering was base. He was both persuasive and deceptive in speech, and would promise more than he would stand by, a master of both wisdom and fooling. He cherished friendships according to their profitableness, not as a matter of honor. He would constantly pretend liking for an enemy, and simulate vexation against those dear to him. It was his practice to stir up discord among allies, and to try to keep in favor with both parties. Add to these traits a distinguished eloquence, pith, and experience as a speaker, with neither ease lacking to ornament, nor ornament to invention. This well-qualified prince now came to the head of affairs in Macedonia, and at once, as if by magic, the pretenders to the throne disappeared, and the hill tribes were broken, the troublesome Paeonian and Illyrian vassals of Macedonia being quelled at last with great slaughter by the man who had learned how to fight from Epaminondas. Philip, however, modified the idea which he had learned from Epaminondas. Both he and Alexander were accustomed to concentrate their strength at one point of the line in the Theban fashion, in order to throw the enemy's ranks into confusion. But they did this with a wedge of cavalry, not of infantry, and with their archers and slingers. The Macedonia phalanx of infantry became dreaded chiefly from the use which its leaders taught it to make of pikes considerably longer than those of the Greeks. Epaminondas had introduced the long pike, but Philip and Alexander used still longer ones. The ordinary Spartan pike was 12 feet in length. The Macedonian sarissa was 14 or 16 feet in length in Alexander's time, and seems afterward to have been increased to the absurd extent of 24 feet. This appears to have been the military hierarchy as Philip left it. All Macedonians were the king's companions, the cavalry being simply known as companions, hetori; the infantry their inferiors in social rank, as the foot commanders, peseteri; a picked force in both forming the agema of each. The most famous infantry corps was that of the guards, hypaspiste, about 3,000 in number, and including the infantry agema. They were afterward known as the Silver Shields, agaraspates. Won fame under Philip and Alexander, and after the latter's death came to a tragic end through their betrayal of their general for a reward. Among other special institutions was that of the somatophylakes, 7 persons of great honor appointed to guard the king's person, evidently as a reward for some great deed. While boys of the chief families of Macedonia were brought up in the court in time of peace, and followed the king to war in the capacity of pages, Philip introduced the first standing professional army, for the Greek and Persian arrays were either citizen or mercenary levies. The citizens could not be kept together for long, and the mercenaries could not always be trusted, but now a national army was in readiness for use at any time that the king wished for it, winter or summer, and in Macedonia it was an army devoted to its king as the tribe is to the chieftain. Philip therefore created the Macedonian army, which was to be his son's instrument in conquering the world. He consolidated the various Macedonian tribes into one nation, and he made that nation a wealthy one by obtaining control of the gold mines of Mount Pangaeus. Commanding these mines stood Amphipolis, near the mouth of the Strymon, the Struma, on its eastern frontier, and Philip outwitted the Athenians and obtained possession of Amphipolis in 357 B.C. He definitely abandoned Aigai and its traditions. The sovereign of Macedonia was to be no more the chieftain of a semi-savage people, but the autocrat of a cultured and powerful Greek realm. Philip's mother only learnt to read in her old age, but Pella might have claimed to be the Athens of the north, when Alexander the Great saw the light there in 356, probably in the month of October. At this time Greece, still blind to coming events, invited Philip, as they had grown used to inviting the great king, to interfere in one of their quarrels. Twice he attacked Phocis, against which a sacred war had been declared, and although he was compelled to withdraw on each occasion, he managed to make himself overlord of Thessaly on his way through, thus adding the fine Thessalian cavalry to the Macedonian army. Then he continued to annex Greek cities on the coast adjoining Macedonia, build a fleet, and at last became a serious menace to Athenian trade. The first person to take the alarm was the Athenian orator Demosthenes, who, by his ardent Philippics, commenced to create a panic in the city. Many people nowadays think that Demosthenes showed lack of political vision, and blame him for throwing obstacles in the path of the force which was at work striving to create a united Greek people. To others he will always remain the last defender of his country's liberties and a prophet who preached military and naval defense, but was unheeded until it was too late. To all he stands for a panic monger whose predictions came to pass. Again and again he sought to unite southern Greece against Philip, and at last he inspired the resistance, which collapsed in 338 B.C. at Chaeronea, fatal to liberty, as Milton sang. Meanwhile Philip was permitted to come south, pass through Thermopylae, and in a third attack on Phocis, destroy the Phocian cities, even Athens lifting no finger to stop him, despite Demosthenes' outcry. Phocis had possessed the presidency of the Amphictyonic League, and this position of high honor Philip received from the servile electors, the name of Phocis being struck off the list altogether. After Demosthenes' second Philippic in 344 B.C., Persia was less hated in Athens than was Macedonia. Philip took little notice. In 342-341, he made Thrace a Macedonian province, and he might have conquered the Chersonese but for Athens. Then, after a successful attack on the barbarians at the mouth of the Danube, he turned south for his last and fateful journey into Greece. This time it was to aid in a sacred war against Amphissa. He was allowed by the anti-Macedonian party to pass Thermopylae, but at Chaeronea, 338 B.C., Thebans and Athenians and the citizens of many a lesser state, including the dispossessed Phocians, stood drawn up in battle array to resist the farther passage of the Macedonian. A bitter struggle took place, and Philip, it is said, would have been slain but for the aid of Alexander, who, now a boy of 18, commanded the cavalry and made the decisive attack on the Greek allies. All fled except the sacred band of Thebes, who fought on until they fell, like Leonidas and his Spartans in the days of old, and so gave to Chaeronea a glory something like that of Thermopylae. Athens became a member of the Macedonian Empire without a further effort, and Philip marched south into the Peloponnesus to try to obtain Sparta's submission. Entirely without a national spirit, Sparta had taken little part in the protection of Greece, but she refused to submit to the invader, and Philip, after devastating her territories, retired, probably grudging the time required for the reduction of this city which was now of so little importance in the world. He then held a congress of Greek states at the Isthmus of Corinth, 337 B.C., and was elected commander-in-chief for a great expedition against Persia. This appointment was the formal acknowledgment of Macedonia's supremacy. There is nothing to show what was the magnitude of Philip's designs against Persia, and owing to the fact that the Athenians and Spartans of Philip's time took no interest in foreign affairs, we are entirely ignorant as to what may have been the nature of the Persian peril at this point, or if it was some commercial advantage which the maker of Macedonia proposed to obtain for his country from his projected invasion. Certain it is that he shares whatever blame there may be for this deed with Alexander, for he sent out his chief general, Parmenio, in 336 B.C., to occupy the other side of the Hellespont and prepare for the passage of his army. In this year, however, an end was put to this active existence by the hand of an assassin. The assassin had a deep enough grievance of his own, but it was known that he was stirred up by Olympias, the mother of Alexander, for a reason of which we shall hear later, and some people thought that Alexander, utterly estranged from his father, had a hand in the business. Olympias was a character as much out of the ordinary as Philip himself. From Philip, Alexander got his extraordinarily wide political grasp, his restless energy, and his indomitable will. His debt to his mother is less certain. She was of the royal family of Epirus, and claimed descent from Achilles, as Philip did from Heracles. She, like Philip, was characterized by a marvelous energy, and she was passionate, revengeful, and mystical, qualities which peer out as rare visitants in Alexander. The chief fact known about her is her following of the new religion which had penetrated into Greece from Thrace during the last few centuries. By the close of the 5th century, the belief of cultured Greeks in the old gods of Olympus had waned. Even a conservative marked the old idea of Charon ready with his ferry boat to take souls across to Hades. There had sprung up, on the ruins of the old faiths, 2 new forms of religion. The philosopher of the stage, Euripides, who exercised the strongest influence on religion from his own time until the Christian era, revived the Greek idea, found in Homer, that human passions are due to possession by the gods, so that Ares, Aphrodite, Dionysus, and Demeter, for example, could enter into a man for their own purposes, perhaps punishment for neglecting their altars, and sway him as they list, to virtue or crime. Thus we find Alexander, before the battle of Issus, sacrificing to the god Fear, and he always thought that he slew Clytus at a drunken feast because Dionysus was angry with him for destroying Thebes, the home of the god's mother, Semele. Above and beyond these deities, however, the Greeks believed that there were powers which punish wrongdoers. The cry of the injured person was in itself a curse, and for the righteous man, as Euripides sang, far away, hidden from the eyes of day, watchers are there in the skies that can see man's life and prize deeds well done by things of clay. The height of the normal faith of Greek and Asiatic in the 4th century B.C., as with the Mohammedan and Japanese of today, was to bow cheerfully to the will of destiny. Orphism, however, had given to those emotionally inclined a more inspiring faith, and Olympias was among its adherents. It was a worship of Dionysus and Orpheus, with mysterious ceremonies kept so closely secret that, although the initiated were very numerous, little is known of their tenets now. There is no sign that Alexander was influenced by Orphism, which was indeed largely a religion of the common people. Philip was tired both of the eccentricities of Olympias and her temper, and took a young wife, Cleopatra, thereby incurring the wrath of both mother and son. Alexander went to his father's wedding feast in no very good mood, and we hear of the first of those fits of passion which were to come on him in after years in the East. When the wine had been circulating freely for some time, the uncle of Cleopatra began to indulge in remarks insulting to Olympias and to Alexander, and speedily received Alexander's drinking cup full in the face. Philip leaped to his feet and drew his sword, ready in his drunken frenzy to slay his son, but slipped and fell, whereupon Alexander stood taunting him. "Look," he cried to the courtiers, "the man who is getting ready to cross over into Asia can't even step from one couch to another." The prince then took his mother to her kinsfolk in Epirus, and himself retired into Illyria. The affair was patched up for appearance's sake, but there remained a bitterness between father and son which nothing could remove, and probably neither Olympias nor Alexander ever forgave the slur put on both of them. There is a pleasanter side to Alexander's relationship with his father, and we shall consider it in the next chapter, but a friendship which seems to have been deep, at least on Philip's side, had unfortunately been broken before the latter's death. End of chapter 2.